Western Civilization. Renaissance to Modern Times. Lecture 1. Monarchies, Limited and Checked or Supreme. In the 1600s to the 1800s, the dominant governing form of absolute rule by kings was checked, limited, and even abolished. Since the development of monarchical forms of government in France and England differ significantly, we will focus our attention on these two countries so as to provide us with the ends of the spectrum that other European people's approach to monarchies fell somewhere between. Throughout a number of centuries, the English gradually and firmly moved to limiting and checking the powers of their monarch by a body known as the Parliament. In contrast, France moved in the opposite direction by granting more and more power to a supreme, unchecked monarch. This accumulation of power in one individual jarringly ended in the terrible French Revolution from 1789 to 1799, during which the French King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were guillotined, and the monarchy was abolished. We will end this lecture with a sampling of some of great art that was created during these turbulent, emotionally charged times. British monarchy and parliament. The British Parliament has its origins in the feudal system that William the Conqueror formed. In 1066, this Norman crossed the English Channel from what is now northern France to conquer the English people. On October 14, 1066, in the Battle of Hastings, William emerged victorious and became the King of England. As king, William formed a council called the Curia Regis that he consulted with. A few centuries later, in 1215, this royal council in a Magna Carta reputedly secured authority to check the power of King John. It is debated whether this transfer of power to what would become known as the English Parliament was intended by King John. As Danny Denzinger argues, the belief that the Magna Carta subordinated the power of the king to the common law of England only came about centuries later when under the Stuart monarchy, those who wanted to increase the powers of the Parliament at the expense of the king hearkened back to this document in order to bolster their claims. The English Parliament's ability to check the authority of the king was not noticeably present during the dynasty that came immediately before the Stuarts. During the Tudor reign, English kings and queens steadily consolidated power in the person of the monarch. The first Tudor to reign as king was Henry VII. Henry gained the crown after he successfully defeated Richard III in the War of the Roses. King Richard III was of a rival aristocratic family called the House of York. As king, Henry VII united the House of Tudor, which he belonged to the House of York by marrying a noblewoman of the House of York, Elizabeth of York. By uniting these two houses, Henry VII centered power in himself. When his son, King Henry VIII, inherited the English crown, he likewise further consolidated power even to the extent of rejecting papal authority and declaring himself head of the Church of England in a Supremacy Act of 1534. In 1547, Henry VIII was succeeded by a sickly son, Edward VI, who was only 9 years old when he inherited the crown. 6 years later, Edward VI died, and following a slightly and substantially altered legal document, the English crown passed briefly to Lady Jane Grey. It is not clear who was responsible for altering the document in order to shift the line of succession from Henry VIII's oldest daughter, Mary. Perhaps Edward was, and possibly one of Edward's counselors did so without sufficient authorization. It is very likely it occurred since Edward, who believed in Protestantism, did not want his Catholic sister Mary to inherit the crown. Lady Jane Grey, though, only reigned for a brief time, known as the 9-day reign, until she was executed in 1554. The next monarch of England was Henry VIII's eldest and very Catholic daughter, Mary I. She reigned from 1553 to 1558. Upon Mary's death in 1558, her half-sister Elizabeth, who identified herself as a Protestant, inherited the throne and ruled as Queen Elizabeth I from 1558 to 1603. Elizabeth I's death in 1603 brought a conclusion to the tight rule of the Tudors and the beginning of the Stuart reign. The House of Stuart reigned over England from 1603 to 1714. As we will see, during this dynastic reign, the English Parliament grew in its ability to check the power of the reigning monarch, which had accumulated much power during the Tudor reign. The first Stuart to reign as King of England was James VI. He was succeeded by his son Charles I. During Charles' rule, the English Parliament, or more specifically the House of Commons, demanded in its 1628 Petition of Right, in which they cited the Magna Carta, that Charles I restore their power to a supposedly more ideal time by not taxing without consent the Parliament, not imprisoning without just consent, not housing soldiers in homes without consent, and not issuing martial law at will. Charles I agreed, but then, after a period of time of much tension with parliamentary leaders, chose to dissolve the Parliament. Charles I's perceived dictatorial manner of relating to the English Parliament erupted in an English civil war between parliamentary forces and King Charles I's military. King Charles I lost the civil war and in 1649 was executed. The period that followed is often called the Interregnum, which in Latin means between kings era. It lasted from 1649 to 1660. During this short period of time, England lacked a king and instead was ruled first by Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector and then by Oliver Cromwell's son Richard Cromwell as Lord Protector. The interregnum ended in 1659 when yet another Stuart, Charles II, son of Charles I, was executed on orders of the Parliament, was restored as the English king in 1660. In 1685, Charles II died, but not before, interestingly, converting to the Catholic faith. He was succeeded by his brother James II, who also was Catholic. Fearing that their Catholic king would consolidate power to the detriment of Protestants, many noble Protestants resisted his rule. Their resistance came to a head when in 1688 they asked a Protestant noble from Holland, William III of Orange, to invade England and take the crown from James II. The 1688 overthrow of the Catholic King James II was named by the Protestant victors the Glorious Revolution. A piece of legislation that Parliament insisted that William of Orange accept before he could be named King William III was the 1689 Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights substantially limited the powers of the English monarchs by checking the English crown's power with parliamentary power. French monarchy and absolutism. We will now turn our attention to the country to which England had been a vassal to since the time of the Norman invasion led by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. In the 14th century, English rulers wished to reverse this power relationship where England was subject to their French overlords. This English goal was expressed by a series of wars called the 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453. It was between England and France. In one of the particularly famous battles, the Battle of Agincourt, the English king Henry V defeated the French at Agincourt. Interestingly, Agincourt is only about 40 miles northwest from Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, the very site that William the Conqueror embarked from in order to invade and conquer England. Upon gaining victory at Agincourt, Henry V began ruling northern France. This angered the French so much that after being inspired by St. Joan of Arc, they fought the English with great intensity. Their attempt to overthrow their English rulers began in 1429 when St. Joan of Arc convinced Charles VII, whom she recognized as the actual French king, to fight the English king, Henry VI, who only claimed to be the French king. After St. Joan of Arc was captured by Burgundians who had allied themselves with England, St. Joan of Arc was tried as a witch in an English-controlled ecclesiastical court and then in 1431 burned at the stake. Even though she had been executed, Her vision of independence from English domination continued to inspire the French people. Finally, in the 1453 Battle of Castillon, France decisively defeated the English. France's battles with England during the Hundred Years' War was a principal factor that helped to cause many French people to desire a centralized state that was united and ruled by an absolute monarch who would guarantee French independence. Practically, this meant that the power of the aristocrats and other centers of power needed to be diminished in order to centralize power in the French king. Under the French king Louis XI, this is precisely what occurred. The almost absolute power of the French monarch reached its apex in another king also named Louis, Louis XIV. He reigned from 1643 to 1715. Louis XIV desire for power was instilled in him by his father, King Louis XIII. Louis XIII continued to centralize power by eliminating rival sources of power. In order to do so, he relied heavily on his prime minister, Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu was devoted to transforming France into a highly centralized state that revolved neatly around its king. Richelieu once promised King Louis XIII the following, and I quote, "I promised your majesty to employ all my industry and all the authority which it should please you to give me to ruin the Huguenot party," which was the French Protestant party, "to abase the pride of the nobles, to bring back all your subjects to their duty, and to elevate your name among foreign nations to the point where it belongs." Following his father's example, Louis XIV amassed so much power that he was called the Sun King. In an effort to eliminate even non-French rivals to his authority, he approved the anti-papal movement known as Gallicanism, named after the ancient Roman province of Gaul that French borders are basically based upon. According to Gallicanism, papal authority does not overrule French bishops, nor does it overrule French secular authority, above all King Louis XIV's supreme authority. Remember, at the same time Louis XIV was accumulating power, across the English Channel, the English Parliament was fighting a civil war with their King Charles I. In 1649, Charles I lost the civil war and was executed. Ever since then, English Parliament has repeatedly and successfully checked the power of their monarchs. Not until 1793, in the midst of the French Revolution, did France respond in a similar way by beheading their king, Louis XIV, and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. We will conclude this lecture by looking at Baroque art. Some of it will be in the background, that, reflecting these times, was emotionally charged. In the 1600s, Baroque art began in Italy and then spread to other European countries. The term comes from the French word barocco, meaning a rough and imperfect pearl. Originally, the term was used to indicate an unrefined artistic expression. Currently, Baroque art is not typically associated in this manner. The art created in this style, named by art historians and not by the artists themselves, often contains much hidden symbolism, freely depicts emotion, displays a human body without inhibitions, is highly naturalistic, uses perspective in a very sophisticated manner, contrasts light with darkness, and focuses much attention on Roman and Greek myths. Bernini. Bernini was a leading Italian sculptor and architect of his time. He even considered himself and is considered as a successor to Michelangelo. An example of his architecture is his open arm-like embrace design of the Piazza San Pietro that is directly in front of St. Peter's Basilica. An example of an intensely emotional sculpture of his is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa of Avila and his Apollo and Daphne sculpture from Greek mythology. Michelangelo. Marici da Caravaggio. Caravaggio is one of Italy's foremost Baroque painters. His art is characterized by its dramatic use of light and darkness. The art historian William Claus points out the similarity of Michelangelo's hand of Adam in the creation of Adam with the hand of Christ in a painting by Caravaggio. And in this painting by Caravaggio, Christ is pointing at Matthew the tax collector. Artemisia Gentileschi. Not all the leading Baroque Italian artists were men. Gentileschi is an example of a leading Baroque artist who was a woman. Similar to Caravaggio and Bernini, she created intensely emotional art. Her painting of Judith beheading Holofernes may have been Artemisia's way of expressing her deep anguish of having been once raped by a married woman who had promised that he would leave his wife to marry her. Diego Velázquez. We will now turn our attention to a non-Italian Baroque artist, the Spaniard Diego Velázquez. One of his most famous paintings is Las Meninas, where he starkly contrasts light with darkness and exhibits a highly sophisticated ability in the use of perspective. Rococo, or Late Baroque, Jean-Honoré Fragonard. The tail end of the Baroque era has been classified as the Rococo period. Rococo adds to the Baroque's emotional intensity with its playful use of curves, creamy colors, and gold. An example of this delightful, fun-filled art is The Happy Accidents of the Swing by the French painter Fragonard. In the painting, a pretty young woman seated on a swing has playfully kicked her slipper off, much to the delight of two men. God bless.